The old man stood at the window with a cigar burning between his fingers, watching the street below, and said nothing for a long time. Winston Churchill had lived 65 years and seen more than most men accumulate in twice that span. Wars, defeats, public humiliation, the rise and fall of empires, the slow grinding work of holding civilization together when everything conspired against it. He was not easily moved. He had trained himself out of easy emotion as a matter of professional survival. But what he was watching on this cold December morning was doing something to his throat that he could not entirely control. It was December 20th, 1939. The war was 3 months old. Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, not yet Prime Minister, though the pressure of events was already making Chamberlain's position untenable in ways that most people could see and Chamberlain himself refused to acknowledge. Churchill watched and waited and worked, as he always had, and today he was watching Canadian soldiers march through the streets of London. The 1st Canadian Division had arrived in Britain only days earlier. 23,000 men had crossed the North Atlantic in winter. Not a small thing, not a comfortable voyage, to fight a war that by any strict legal or political accounting was not theirs. Canada had no obligation to be here. The memory of the last war was still fresh enough to justify staying home. 60,000 Canadians dead in France and Belgium, a generation of young men reduced to names on memorials in towns across the country. No one would have called it cowardice if Canada had declined to participate in another European catastrophe. But here they were. Churchill watched them move below. The formations were precise, the intervals between men exact, the movement of hundreds of soldiers synchronized into something that was both military function and a kind of geometry. Their boots struck the pavement in unison, producing the particular sound of trained troops in formation, sharp, rhythmic, a sound that carried information if you knew how to read it. These men had been drilled until the drill became instinct. Most of them had never been in a fight. Most had never left Canada. They were farmers and miners and fishermen, shop clerks and students and factory workers, men who had looked at the world from wherever they stood in it, decided something had to be done, and volunteered. Every one of them had volunteered. Churchill's private secretary, Colville, stood behind him with a folder of Navy equipment matters that had seemed pressing an hour ago and now felt entirely irrelevant. "Do you know what I see, Colville?" Churchill said without turning from the window. "Sir?" "The future, or at least hope for one." His mind went back to Vimy Ridge, Easter Monday, 1917. 4 Canadian divisions had done in a single day what British and French forces had failed to accomplish in 3 years of trying. They had taken that high ground through careful planning, tactical innovation, and a kind of controlled ferocity that had left the German defenders unable to respond. The cost had been terrible, 10,000 casualties in 3 days. But they had won, and in winning, they had proved something that Churchill and many others had not fully understood before. The men from the Dominions were not supplementary forces, not colonial auxiliaries padding out British numbers. They were warriors in their own right, often better trained and more tactically flexible than British units that had calcified under the weight of institutional tradition. By the end of the war, the Canadian Corps had become the most feared assault force on the Western Front. German intelligence knew that when Canadian divisions appeared in a sector, an attack was coming, and the attack would be brutal. Now they were back. Churchill finally turned from the window. Colville was waiting patiently, folders in hand, expression neutral. "Cancel my morning meetings," Churchill said. "Sir, you have the War Cabinet at 11 and the—" "Cancel them. Move them. Make up whatever excuse is necessary." He was already reaching for his coat. "I'm going down." Colville looked briefly confused. "Down where?" "To the street. To meet them properly." "Sir, there's no official ceremony planned." "The protocols—" Churchill was buttoning his coat. "To hell with protocols. Those men crossed an ocean in December to fight a war that isn't technically theirs. The minimum we owe them is a handshake." 20 minutes later, Churchill was standing on the pavement in Whitehall while the column continued past him. The cold was immediate and genuine, the kind that gets into your hands despite gloves and doesn't leave. Word spread quickly among the government buildings nearby, and a handful of officials had drifted out to observe, uncertain why the First Lord of the Admiralty was standing in the street watching troops. A young Canadian officer noticed Churchill first. His eyes widened in recognition, and he snapped an order. His section halted, came to attention. The effect rippled down the column as other officers caught on and followed suit. Churchill walked up to the officer, who looked no older than 25. His name tag read Morrison. He saluted correctly, and Churchill returned it, then extended his hand. "Where are you from, Lieutenant?" "Saskatchewan, sir. A town called Moose Jaw. A long way from home." "Yes, sir, but we're where we need to be." Churchill moved along the line, shaking hands, asking questions in the way he had learned to ask them over decades of public life. Simply, without performance, with genuine attention to the answers. "Where are you from? How was the crossing? Are you being properly looked after?" The men responded with a mixture of pride and nerves that Churchill recognized from every conflict he had been part of. Young men in the presence of history, not entirely sure what to do with the feeling. One soldier, a private who looked barely old enough to have been conscripted, though Churchill knew he had volunteered, had tears in his eyes. "What's your name, son?" "Private Davies, sir. John Davies. From Toronto." "Why the tears? Private Davies?" The young man steadied himself. "My grandfather fought in South Africa, sir. Under your command. He used to tell me stories about you." A pause. "He died last year. I wish he could see this." Churchill felt the weight of that. He had commanded men in South Africa 40 years ago, men not much different from this boy's grandfather, some of whom had not come home from that campaign. The responsibility had never fully left him. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," he said quietly. "I can promise you that." Major General Andrew McNaughton, commanding the 1st Canadian Division, had been riding near the middle of the column when word reached him that Churchill was personally on the street. He rode forward, dismounted, and saluted. General McNaughton. Churchill had met him briefly before. "Your men are magnificent." "They're eager to serve, sir." Churchill led McNaughton a few steps away from the nearest soldiers, not so far they couldn't be seen, but far enough for a real conversation. "I want you to understand something, General," Churchill began. "There are people in this government who see your men as reinforcements, gap fillers, numbers to compensate for our own recruiting shortfalls. I am not one of those people." McNaughton's expression was carefully composed. "I remember what Canadians did in the last war," Churchill continued. "Vimy, Passchendaele, the 100 Days. I remember that when British and French divisions were finished, exhausted, fought out, incapable of another push, it was the Canadians who kept attacking, who kept winning, who kept pressing the Germans back until the line broke. I remember all of it. He looked at the ranks of young men who had come from the far side of the world. Your men are not here to be spent in pointless offensives dreamed up by commanders who learned nothing from the last war. They are not cannon fodder. They are not expendable. They are warriors, and they will be treated as such. You have my word. McNaughton studied him for a moment. With respect, sir, you are not Prime Minister. You are not in a position to make those promises. Not yet. Not yet, Churchill agreed. But I will be, sooner than most people expect. And when I am, I will remember this conversation. I will remember these faces. I will remember that Canada answered the call when she had every reason not to. McNaughton nodded slowly. We appreciate that, sir. But you should understand something as well. We didn't come as a favor. We didn't come out of colonial obligation or imperial sentiment. We came because this fight is real, and because if Britain falls, the world that follows won't be one we can live in. We're not doing you a service, Mr. Churchill. We're fighting for our own survival, the same as you. Churchill felt something shift in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. Then we understand each other perfectly, General, which makes us not merely allies, but something more. They shook hands again. McNaughton remounted and rode back to his column. The march resumed. Churchill stood and watched the men continue past until they rounded the corner and were gone. The other officials who had drifted out had mostly returned to their offices and their warm rooms. Only Colville remained, shivering beside him with quiet loyalty. Do you know the population of Canada, Colville? Around 11 million, sir. 11 million. Churchill turned the number over. The same as Greater London, an entire country. A vast country, Atlantic to Pacific, larger than Europe, with the same population as this city. And they have sent us 23,000 men, with more promise to follow. He began walking back toward the Admiralty building, Colville falling into step beside him. In the last war, Canada sent 600,000 men. 60,000 of them died. 1 in 10 of everyone who served. He paused. Those aren't numbers, Colville. They're empty chairs. They're children who grew up without fathers. They're women who spent the rest of their lives alone. They're the gap in a generation that no arithmetic captures adequately. Yes, sir. And yet here they are again. Every one of them a volunteer, nobody conscripted, nobody compelled. They chose to come. He was quiet for a moment. Make sure those men are properly quartered. Good food, warm accommodation, decent facilities. I want reports on their conditions. If there are problems, I want to know immediately. Sir, that falls under the War Office rather than the Admiralty. I don't care whose responsibility it is. Make it happen. The months that followed were strange. The phony war, the newspapers called it. A period of military tension without actual combat. Both sides maneuvering, preparing, waiting for the real thing to begin. The Canadians trained on Salisbury Plain as their fathers had done a generation before, learning British weather, British food, British military bureaucracy, and complaining about all three while doing their jobs with characteristic efficiency. Churchill saw them again in March during an inspection tour. He was already concerned that his promise to McNaughton was proving harder to keep than he had intended. The Canadians were being treated as another division. routine assignments, no special consideration, no particular recognition of what it meant that they were there at all. He made calls, sent memos, worked behind the scenes to keep Canadian forces together as a unified corps rather than dispersing them piecemeal as gaps in British order of battle demanded. April brought the end of the phony war. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Chamberlain's government mishandled the response in ways that were visible to everyone watching. The Norway campaign was a failure, and the political consequences arrived in May. On May 10th, 1940, the same day Germany launched its assault on France in the Low Countries, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. His first words to Parliament were not reassurance or false optimism. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." He meant every word. 3 weeks later, the situation in France was catastrophic. The German breakthrough had shattered the French army and trapped the British Expeditionary Force against the coast. More than 300,000 men were eventually rescued from Dunkirk, a deliverance that was also, unmistakably, a defeat. The Canadians had been held in reserve through most of the French campaign. When the evacuation began, Canadian units were committed to help hold the perimeter, securing the line, covering withdrawals, buying hours that translated into lives. They were among the last to leave. Private John Davies, who had cried when Churchill shook his hand in December, did not make it out. He died on June 3, 1940, holding a position in a ruined farmhouse while his section fell back to the beach. He was 19 years old. Lieutenant Morrison from Moose Jaw survived, but took shrapnel from a mortar round that killed 2 of his men. He was evacuated to England and spent 2 months in hospital before returning to duty. Churchill read every name on the casualty lists. He had made this habit in the First War and never abandoned it. When he saw Davies on the Dunkirk list, he sat with it for a moment before continuing. 19 years old. That boy's grandfather had fought in South Africa under Churchill's own command and had died only a year ago. And now the grandson was gone too, and there was no grave, only the sea. Later that night, alone with a glass of whiskey and a cigar, Churchill sat with the weight of all the men who had died and all the men who would still die before this was finished. He had told McNaughton in December that Canadians would not be wasted in pointless offensives. He had meant it, but good intentions did not stop artillery shells, and soldiers died in good operations as well as bad ones. The only thing he could do was make sure the deaths counted for something, make sure the war was won, and make sure the world that came after was worth what it had cost. The summer of 1940 was the darkest period. France had fallen. Most of Europe was under German control. Britain stood alone, waiting for an invasion that seemed not a question of if, but when. The Luftwaffe began its campaign to destroy British air power as the prerequisite for a seaborne assault, and the Canadians redeployed to the southern coast to help defend against it. They dug positions, strung wire, prepared to fight on the beaches exactly as Churchill had promised the nation they would. They were ready. They had been waiting for this for months, and the waiting had sharpened rather than dulled them. The invasion never came. The Royal Air Force defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, and Hitler eventually abandoned his invasion plans in favor of turning east against the Soviet Union. The Canadians remained in England, training, growing more professional with each passing season. More divisions arrived from Canada. The 1st Canadian Division became the 1st Canadian Corps and then the 1st Canadian Army. By 1942, more than 200,000 Canadian soldiers were stationed in Britain, the largest volunteer army Canada had ever assembled. In August 1942 came Dieppe, and with it the worst day the Canadians had experienced since the last war. The raid was misconceived from its origins, an amphibious assault on a fortified French port with inadequate preparation, inadequate fire support, and inadequate intelligence. Nearly 1,000 Canadians were killed and almost 2,000 captured. The operation achieved nothing of strategic value. Churchill was furious when the full picture emerged, demanding to know who had authorized the mission and why Canadian forces had been chosen for it. The answers were unsatisfying. A planning process distributed across multiple committees, approvals at multiple levels, decisions that everyone had authorized and no one had owned. The Canadians had been used because they were eager, well-trained, and available. None of those were good enough reasons to send men into what became a slaughter. Churchill ensured there were consequences. Officers were reassigned. Planning procedures were overhauled. And he made clear that Canadian forces would not be committed to major operations without his personal oversight. He had failed to protect them at Dieppe. He would not fail again. The lessons purchased with Canadian blood at Dieppe were eventually applied to the planning for D-Day. The failures taught the Allies what not to do, lessons that shaped every aspect of the Normandy planning that followed. Lieutenant Morrison recovered from his wounds by late 1943. He was promoted to captain and given command of a company. He trained his men with everything 3 years of war had taught him, not from a manual, but from accumulated experience, from watching what worked and what got men killed. On June 6, 1944, Morrison and his company were among the Canadian soldiers who stormed Juno Beach. They took severe casualties getting ashore. They did not stop. They pushed inland faster than any other Allied force on D-Day, reaching objectives that the planning had scheduled for the following day. Morrison survived D-Day. He survived Normandy. He survived the fighting through France and Belgium and into the Netherlands. He was wounded twice more and refused evacuation both times, staying with his men. He was on his feet on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered. Churchill heard the news at Chequers. He was 70 years old and exhausted in ways that went deeper than the physical. 5 years of bearing a weight that would have broken most men. 5 years of decisions whose consequences ran to hundreds of thousands of deaths. 5 years of sustaining a nation's will through the periods when the situation provided no reasonable grounds for optimism. That night, he thought about December 1939, about the sound of 23,000 pairs of boots on the pavement in Whitehall, about McNaughton's straight-back dignity and his plain statement that Canada had not come as a favor, but as a matter of survival, about Private Davies, who had cried when Churchill shook his hand and who had gone into the sea at Dunkirk and never come back. Canada had put more than 1 million men and women in uniform during the war. More than 45,000 of them had died, but they had won. Years later, when Churchill wrote about that December morning, he did not soften it into sentiment or harden it into military analysis. He wrote about it as a man who had seen a great many things and knew which ones had actually mattered. I have fought in wars, and I have lost elections. I have been praised and condemned, elevated and cast down. But I have never been more moved than I was that cold December morning, watching young men from across the sea march past my window, knowing they had come to fight for a cause that was not originally their own, but which they had chosen to make their own. In that moment, I saw not just soldiers, but the very best of what humanity can produce when it chooses freely to stand for something larger than itself. He added a note about Davies. I learned later that young Davies died at Dunkirk. His body was never recovered. He has no grave but the sea and the memories of those who knew him. I think of him often, what he might have become, what life he might have built, what children he might have raised. The debt we owe to men like Davies cannot be calculated, only acknowledged. We can only strive to build a world worthy of the price they paid. Captain Morrison went home to Moose Jaw when the war ended. He married the woman he had been writing letters to throughout, raised 4 children, and spent 35 years teaching high school. He rarely talked about the war. It was a generational habit, not denial, but the privacy of people who had been through something they did not feel needed, explaining to those who hadn't. Every Remembrance Day he put on his old uniform and stood at attention during the ceremony at the local cenotaph. When Churchill died in January 1965, Morrison watched the funeral on television. The state procession, the lying in state, the hundreds of thousands who came to pay their respects to the man who had held the worst years together by force of will and language and sheer refusal to accept the available conclusions. Morrison remembered a London street in December 1939. A cold morning. A large man in a heavy coat who had canceled his morning meetings and come downstairs to shake the hand of a lieutenant from Moose Jaw. He kept his promise, Morrison told his wife that evening. Not all of it. No one could have kept all of it. But he tried. We weren't just numbers to him. We mattered. There is a photograph taken that day by a newspaper photographer who happened to be passing through Whitehall and recognized Churchill. It shows Churchill on the pavement, hand extended, shaking hands with a young officer. The officer's face shows pride and nervousness in roughly equal measure. Churchill's face shows something rarer in photographs of powerful men, genuine attention, warm and unperformed. The photograph ran in a small Canadian newspaper a week later and was mostly forgotten. Morrison kept a copy for the rest of his life. It hung in his study next to his medals and his discharge papers and a faded group photograph of his company. When his children asked about it, he would tell them the story. The ocean crossing in winter, London in December, the day Winston Churchill had walked out of a government building on a cold morning to shake the hands of men who had come a very long way to be there. He looked me in the eye, Morrison would say, and he thanked me, not the way politicians thank people for their service, like a man who understood what it meant that we'd come. That, Morrison always said, was something he never forgot.